9. SS Airfield. The SS Airfield is found in Australia's Homebush Bay. Homebush Bay was once a bustling port with many small businesses and industries lining the water's shores, sending their trade out through freighters in the docks. Although the area has seen a breath of new life over the past 20 years, thanks to the 2000 Sydney Olympics, there are still 4 rustling historic remnants of the area's industrial past floating in the nearby waters. Left to rust where they were anchored, 4 ships are abandoned here, but one of these shipwrecks stands out above the rest. The SS Airfield has a whole grove of mangrove trees covering its upper deck, turning it into a real floating forest. The ship was built in 1911, so it's over 110 years old. With the sheer amount of trees that have taken over, it's a mystery how it stays afloat. It's unknown how long the SS Airfield can keep carrying on above the water as the tree roots dig into its hull, but for now, it remains the fanciest orchard on the high seas. 8. HMS Endurance. Some amazing shipwrecks are in remarkable condition for their age, even the ones made out of wood. The HMS Endurance was a ship used by explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton while he explored the icy regions of Antarctica, but the vessel got stuck in the dense ice of Antarctica's Weddell Sea in 1915, slowly sinking beneath the waves while Shackleton and his men looked on. What happened next is one of the most impressive survival stories ever, as the explorer and his crew braved deadly conditions to reach safety. The wreck of the HMS Endurance remained undiscovered until 2022, over 100 years after it first sank. It was found by the Endurance 22 expedition, and the crew was amazed by what they saw. Despite sitting on the bottom of the sea for over a century, the Endurance was perfectly preserved, as if the vessel had been frozen still in time. The wood was pretty much intact, and they could even see the gold lettering of the ship's name painted on the stern. The reason the boat has stayed in such remarkable condition is because of where it sank. Due to the icy temperatures of the water, wood-eating bacteria and sea creatures simply can't survive in the environment. That doesn't mean the wreck of the Endurance is devoid of life, though. Many anemones, sea sponges, and marine creatures now call Shackleton's infamous ship their new home. 7. Sweepstakes. Sweepstakes was a double-masted wooden schooner built in 1867 in Ontario, Canada. In August 1885, the 119-foot-long ship was transporting coal when it sustained damage while sailing past Cove Island. Still afloat despite the damage she received, Sweepstakes was towed to the safety of Big Tub Harbor in Tobermory by a tugboat named Jessie. But when she reached the top of the harbor, it was clear the damage to Sweepstakes was substantial. Try as they might to repair the ship, in the end, it was a losing battle, and Sweepstakes sank to the bottom of the harbor in September that year. Although we don't know what happened to her crew, we do know they were able to salvage all of the coal Sweepstakes was carrying from the wreck. Almost 140 years later, you don't even need to dive in order to see the Sweepstakes in its final resting place. She lies in such shallow, clear water that you can see her from standing on the surface. But if you do take the plunge and dive down 20 feet, you'll realize that she's in great shape for her age. The vessel is pretty much still in one piece, although she has lost her masts. You can still see the entire hull, deck, windlass, and even some of the railings on her sides. For those who feel a little bit more brave, you can even swim into Sweepstakes' hold and take a look inside. 6. Iron Scow. The Iron Scow sits on top of the famous U.S. natural landmark, Niagara Falls. The iron-hulled vessel sits close to the edge of the massive waterfall, almost as if it's poised there for some sort of a stunt in a movie. As for how it got there, we need to go back over 100 years to 1918. On August 6th, a dumping scow was attached to a towboat, with 2 men working on board the tiny boat. For some reason, the scow broke free from its tethers and floated rapidly downstream thanks to the strong currents of the Niagara River. Amazingly, instead of plunging over the waterfall, the iron scow managed to stop just short of the edge. It lodged tight onto some rocks in the rapids right before the falls, and remained there for 101 years, stuck in place and time. That was until October 31st, 2019. A strong weather front blew in, bringing heavy winds and rain. The iron scow dislodged from its century-long resting place and started to coast towards the edge of Niagara once again, as people wondered whether the boat would finally plunge over the top for good. But the scow stopped short and remains at the top of these famous falls. Now the debate rests on if or when it will finally make its last journey down Niagara for good. What do you think will happen to the iron scow? Let us know in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 5. HMS Vixen. HMS Vixen was built in 1865 and was a trailblazer for her time. Commissioned by Britain, she was a composite armored gunboat and one of the only of her kind. If that wasn't enough, HMS Vixen was also the first vessel used by the British Royal Navy that had twin propellers to help push her through the waves. Made with a skeleton of iron and covered with a layer of strong teak wood up to 5.5 inches, her 4 steam engines gave her 740 horsepower. The same strength as some sports cars today. But she wasn't going anywhere in a hurry, since she only had a top speed of 8.9 knots, the equivalent of 10 miles per hour. Despite the technological features that made her one of a kind, the Vixen proved she was not exactly suited to open sea sailing. She and another ship, HMS Viper, were towed across the Atlantic Ocean in 1868 to Bermuda, where they would act as defensive ships for the Royal Navy dockyard. HMS Vixen had many tough scrapes with weather. In 1873, she lost all of her masts, rigging, and equipment from her upper deck. Just 3 years later, in 1876, she nearly sank in the Irish Channel, with damage so severe she would no longer be able to operate in open sea. In 1878, a hurricane swept over Bermuda, causing massive damage to many ships and the floating dock. HMS Vixen managed to survive this, thanks to the removal of her masts and deck equipment 5 years before. By 1895, HMS Vixen had outlived her use as a defensive ship and was being used to house dockyard laborers as a floating bunkhouse. That same year, she was set to be sold, but HMS Vixen's end came in 1896. 1 year later, she was purposefully sunk using scuttling charges in order to become a blockade for a water channel around David's Head in Bermuda. Nowadays, she lies in a gap in the coral reef with her bow poking out over the waves, fascinating historians and tourists. 4. Hermes. The Hermes was a U.S. Navy ship built in 1943. She measured 165 feet and was pretty small. She was special considering the way she was built and has a unique layout, unlike any other vessel. The cargo hold of Hermes was in the front part of the ship. Her mast was also near the prow, being right in front of the wheelhouse. As a result of this, a cargo boom could be attached to the mast, allowing the ship to pick up floating navigation buoys and drop them into the hold. Hermes was heading towards Cape Verde with her crew in the 1980s, when she started having engine trouble near Bermuda. Although her crew stayed on for a while, eventually they left the boat stranded when it became clear the repair costs were not justifiable. Hermes was eventually put up for sale. By 1985, no buyers were interested in the ship, so the government of Bermuda made the decision the vessel would be handed over to the Bermuda Divers Association to be made into an artificial reef. On May 15, 1985, Hermes was scuttled off of Horseshoe Bay. This unwanted wreck is now one of the most popular diving spots in all of Bermuda. 3. The Vasa. One of the most advanced warships of the 17th century was also very short-lived. Vasa was a Swedish warship classed as the biggest Navy achievement at the time. The vessel was truly a sight to behold, and historians have even called it the most spectacular warship ever built. It was finished in 1628 and has beautiful wooden carvings on its hull that tell the history of the Swedish royal family. Commissioned by the king, Gustav II Adolf himself, Vasa also boasted 64 bronze cannons, the most that had ever been carried by a warship during the time. As you can imagine, the maiden voyage of Vasa was a grand and talked about affair. Many members of the public gathered to watch it set sail on August 10, 1628, including the royal family. But the show they had all gathered to see was completely different from the one that unfolded. Just 20 minutes into its departure from Stockholm harbor, a fierce gust of wind struck the Vasa. The warship was able to withstand the first gust, but then a second hit. The Vasa immediately started to sink as its adoring public could only watch in horror. There have been many debates over the years on what led to the Vasa's swift demise. Some believe it was due to its rushed construction, and others think the gun deck was weighed down too much by all of the cannons. Vasa stayed at the bottom of the Baltic Sea until 1961, when she was painstakingly raised from the seabed. Remarkably, the ship was fairly well preserved due to the cold waters she rested in. Today, she finds her home in the Vasa Museum, which was named after her and is the only preserved example of a 17th century ship found anywhere in the world. 2. Melkmaid. In October 1659, a Dutch merchant ship named Melkmaid, which translates to milkmaid, finished loading its hold in Iceland with valuable cargo to take back to Amsterdam and sell. As they passed by Flatey Island, a storm started to brew. Instead of pushing through and sailing in the rough weather, the crew instead decided to lay anchor and wait until the storm passed. Unfortunately, this did not work as they hoped. Over the next 2 days, the 15-man crew desperately tried to stop the ship from sinking, but nothing they did could stop Melkmaid from falling beneath the waves, losing a member in the process. The remaining 14 crew managed to make their way to Flatey Island. Due to winter settling in, they spent the next few months there until more forgiving weather came, thousands of miles away from their homeland. As for Melkmaid, she would lay at the bottom of the sea for centuries, until she was uncovered by 2 divers in 1992. The following year, a scientific expedition took place, and in 2016, another study was carried out. Not only is Melkmaid the oldest shipwreck in Icelandic waters, but it is also an archaeological site of significance, thanks to the artifacts found on board, like pottery and other fine goods destined for Dutch markets. 1. MS World Discoverer. Laying on its side in shallow waters off the Solomon Islands coast is the MS World Discoverer. This cruise ship was built in 1974 and was used by a few cruise liner companies here and there, like Biwa Cruises and Adventure Cruises. The ship traveled around the world, taking many passengers with her on her journeys. She faithfully served travelers for over 25 years, until April 2000, when everything went wrong. The Discoverer was sailing past the Solomon Islands when bad weather started to come in. Normally, this would not be a problem, but the strong waves and currents steered the liner into a coral reef. Stranded, her captain, Oliver Crewis, radioed help for the crew and passengers on board. Thankfully, he got a response, and local ferries grouped together to get everyone on board to safety. With everyone now off the ship, Captain Crewis managed to limp the MS World Explorer further inland into Roderick Bay, where she now sits leaning on her side. Over time, she has started to deteriorate, and much of what may have been valuable on her decks has been taken by looters. But MS World Explorer still draws the attention of tourists and photographers looking to get a snapshot of this historic shipwreck. Thanks for watching. Which of these shipwrecks fascinated you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time.